This is about the relationship of plants and people, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's actually plenty of ugly you'll find. Try not to go too much. I tried to find some happy stories, and there's some interesting anecdotes and things like that. I don't know how many of them are true, but they were written, and I tried to verify them. But yeah, I actually did a lot of research. I've got a couple of books I picked up, Wikipedia, of course, some interesting information, plenty of internet websites. I haven't put a bibliography together, unfortunately, but if you're interested further in any of these topics, some of them have an awful lot of information written about them, and I'll point to that when we get there. In fact, I have a whole book on just, what's it called? Something about cotton. Anyway, Cotton Empire. So we're going to start with a little bit of biology, which some of you may know, some of you may not. I was interested in basically how plants came to be, and I found something interesting about that. Agriculture, extremely important to development of human history. And the quest for spices and exotic plants and foods impacted the world's.
Listen, we want.
Right.
Oh, is it okay? Is that good? It's not that big, hold on, sure.
All right, get some noise here. Okay, and yeah, get a little fun here. What's wrong with having a sweet tooth? You'll find out there's plenty wrong with that, and that's not a medical thing. Everybody needs a little fiber. You'll find about that from plants. And why the heck would somebody eat the bark from a tree? Well, some of you may know that already, but you know, the first guy who did that. And I learned out how Hong Kong became British. So that was pretty interesting. Again, some of you may know all this stuff, but I didn't know it all. I thought it was a fascinating research project. So most of the information will actually come from my voice, not from the slides. I've tried to summarize some of the information on the slides, just to get an idea of what I'm talking about. All right, so really, thank you, plants. Because without plants, we wouldn't be here. They're the first link in the food chain. If you're at oxygen, of course. They regulate the atmosphere via transpiration on all those wonderful leaves. And of course, they have practical uses such as fuel, fiber, medicines, building materials, etc. Agriculture and all forms of use of plants really provide jobs for millions of people. And a lot of people just love gardening, nurturing plants for their form, their fragrance, and much more, including food. So we have a lot to be thankful for plants. So how did they develop? Well, you can follow that little diagram on the right-hand side. Mine's kind of half covered up by pictures, but so I'm going to read a little bit what I've got here. It says, it all can be traced back to one green cell. The world's profusion of plants owes their existence to a tiny algae eons ago that swallowed a cyanobacterium, a free-ranging photosynthesizer, and turned it into an internal solar power plant. So before there were plants like we know today, they were just this tiny algae floating around that really didn't make their own food. It's also theorized that a bacterial parasite provided the genes that enabled the ferrying of food from the domesticated cyanobacteria, which we now know as a chloroplast, to the host cell. So what interesting I found is just like mitochondria in human cells, chloroplasts still possess their own DNA separate from the nuclear DNA of the plant host cells. So we're not that dissimilar, I guess, in some ways to plants. Early plant life was restricted to the ocean and included various forms of marine algae, both unicellular and multicellular. About 430 million years ago, the cooler, moisture climates in certain regions, together with the availability of large and stable coastal environments and the formation of soils, allowed the migration of plants from the water to the land. Fossil evidence for the occurrence of this are spores with decay-resistant walls adapted to conditions of land away from the aquatic environment. Many structures that plants require in order to overcome gravity, keep from drying out, and reproduce would be developed gradually over millions of years. Molecular and fossil evidence has complicated the evolutionary model that explains how plants evolved from simple to complex forms. By the late Permian period, seed plants represented over 60% of flora. These are called gymnosperms that have unenclosed or naked seeds on the surface of scales or leaves or as cones, and are represented by conifers. So pine cones are gymnosperms and have seeds that are really not encased in anything to protect them. But between 250 and 200 million years ago, flowering plants, known as angiosperms, started to appear. Their leaves were remodeled to attract pollinators, which I'm certain were developing at that time, and accomplished reproductive functions. Their seeds have an outer coating that allows them to survive harsh conditions as the environment changes. So you can imagine as, areas dry out, weather changes, hot and cold, the seeds would actually survive for an angiosperm, whereas for the gymnosperms, they wouldn't survive. And they had different methods of reproducing, so I didn't cover that. By the end of the Cretaceous, the majority of today's angiosperm families had evolved and attained worldwide dominance, except at the highest latitudes where the vegetation was mainly composed of conifers and ferns. Now, angiosperms are more widely distributed and populous, make up 90% of all plant life and can be considered the dominant plant life on the planet. And there's somewhere between 250 and 400,000 species of them. So that's a lot of variety. All right, agriculture and civilizations. For the majority of the time humans have existed, hunter-gatherer culture was the way of life. The lifestyle of hunter-gatherers was based on hunting animals and foraging for wild vegetation and other nutrients like honey. These early humans used mobility as a survival strategy. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle required access to large areas of land between 700 and 500 square miles to find the food they needed for survival. This made establishing long-term settlements impractical, so most hunter-gatherers were nomadic. These groups constantly faced danger as they had no permanent shelter, leaving and exposed to the elements, wild animals, or enemies from rival groups. Agriculture began to develop when human demand for food exceeded the supply available from natural vegetation. The development of agriculture is one of humanity's major evolutionary steps. With agriculture, people could stay in one place, permanent structures were built for shelter, and nomads became villagers. So out of agriculture, cities and civilizations grew, and because crops and animals could now be farmed to meet demand, the global population skyrocketed. Larger groups gave rise to new challenges and required more sophisticated social infrastructure and social hierarchies. These hierarchies were populated with people playing specialized roles, such as professional administrators, farmers, artisans, traders, merchants, and spiritual leaders. Today, most societies are no longer formed around the production of food. Advances in agriculture have raised crop yields such that developed countries no longer spend a significant amount of resources feeding the population. In 2019, there were approximately 2 million farms in the United States, but that represented only about 1% of the population. However, agriculture is now a global business with crops grown where appropriate and traded around the world. Corn and soybeans grown in the U.S. are shipped to China and elsewhere. We buy fruits from tropical locations and fresh vegetables from South America when it's winter here. The global nature of agriculture can also overcome local crop failures, something which early societies struggled. So even though civilizations came out of agriculture, they were still susceptible to crop failures, years-long droughts, and sometimes civilizations actually disappeared because of the weather conditions. So it wasn't a cure-all to gang together in villages and cities, but it certainly was a major step. Trade and exploration. So it's really, I said, spice trade changed the world. And of course, you probably all know about the Orient and all the spices. From the second millennium BC onwards, at least some people in the Eastern Mediterranean had access to food from distant locations, including South Asia. The key role of long-distance trade in the transformation of cuisines worldwide has been well documented since at least the Roman era. The first civilizations began trading with each other about 5,000 years ago, and trade was a boom for human interaction, bringing cross-cultural contact to a whole new level. When people first settled down into larger towns in Mesopotamia and Egypt, self-sufficiency, the idea that you had to produce absolutely everything that you wanted or needed, started to fade. A farmer could now trade grain for meat or milk for a pot. Maybe they did buy pot, I don't know, but at the local market, which was seldom too far away. Pepper, really black pepper, along with other spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, was such a hot commodity 5 centuries ago that it drove nations to sail across vast oceans searching for new routes to the spice-rich Orient. Spices didn't just make merchants rich across the globe, it established vast empires. It revealed entire continents to Europeans and tipped the balance of world power. If the modern age has a definitive beginning, it was sparked by the spice trade, some historians have argued. Spices were an important component of ancient commerce well before the 15th century, but were monopolized for centuries by Middle Eastern and North African middlemen who guarded the Asian provenance of their valuable sources closely and became fabulously wealthy for it. Back then, the colorful grains were used for flavoring food, but also for such tasks as making perfume, embalming the dead, preserving meat, and sprucing up salve recipes in traditional medicine. Europe was at the far end of the trading chain for spices without access to Eastern sources or the power to contest exorbitant prices. At one point in the 1300s, when tariffs were at their highest, a pound of nutmeg in Europe cost the equivalence of 7 fattened oxen and was a more valuable commodity than gold. So you have some spices on your shelf that are getting old, you might be able to cash them in on the stock market. All right. Even the aristocracy, one of the biggest consumers of imported spices, began finding it hard to afford their shipments of peppercorn and cloves. So by the 1400s, when navigational equipment had improved to the point that long-haul sailing became possible, the kings and queens of Europe set out to change the balance of world trade by funding spice hunting missions of their own. First to travel was Christopher Columbus, who was searching for a quicker route to India, and he bumped into the Americas instead. Disappointed he hadn't reached India, Columbus named for the native people who he encountered in America and their local version of the spicy condiment, Indians and peppers, stuck nonetheless. Also looking for spices was Vasco da Gama, who was the first around Africa, and a crew led by Magellan fully circumnavigated the globe. So I found this interesting tidbit. So the map of the colonial period was largely drawn in those frenzied years when all of Europe clamored for a piece of the spice trade, using dubious and often brutal tactics to establish a foothold in India and Southeast Asia. Spain and Portugal spent much of the 16th century fighting over cloves, while England and Dutch dueled over nutmeg in Indonesia. Full of nutmeg trees, a tiny island called Run, which is part of the Banda Islands, became the world's most valuable real estate for a time in the 1600s. England gave it up to the Netherlands in the Treaty of Breda to end their hostilities between the two nations. In exchange for Run, the Netherlands swapped a couple of colonies across the pond, including what is now known as the island of Manhattan. So I thought that was, the Indians, I guess, got it first. The Dutch got it from the Indians, and then they gave it to England for some nutmeg. All right. fascination with pineapples. This was the most curious thing I came across. Little is known about the domestication, but it spread as a crop throughout South America and eventually reached the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico, where it was cultivated by the Mayas and the Aztecs. The first European to encounter the pineapple was, of course, Columbus in Guadeloupe on November 4th, 1493, by which time pineapple was widely distributed and a stable component of the diet of Native Americans. Columbus brought the plant back to Spain and called it Piña de Indies, meaning pine of the Indians. They all felt it looked like a pine cone. The fateful pineapple that Christopher Columbus brought to King Ferdinand of Spain was the only one that hadn't rotted during the journey. The pineapple fascinated Europeans as a fruit of colonization, but it could not be successfully cultivated in Europe. So because of the expense of direct import, the enormous cost and equipment and labor required to grow them in a temperate climate, using hothouses called pineries, pineapples soon became a symbol of wealth. Pineapple plants were distributed from the Netherlands to English gardeners in 1719 and French ones in 1730. In England, the first pineapple was grown at Dorney Court, Dorney in Buckinghamshire, and a huge pineapple stove, they called it, to heat the plants was built at the Chelsea Physic Garden in 1723. In France, King Louis XV was presented with a pineapple that had been grown in Versailles in 1733. And in Russia, Catherine the Great ate pineapples grown on her own estate before 1796. The English upper class considered the exotic and rather costly pineapple to be a suitable present for friends and those they hoped to impress. At dinner parties, the precious fruit often took the place of honor at the top of a fruit pyramid rather than being eaten, and it was used again and again until it began to rot. When demand for pineapples exceeded the supply, members of the English gentry could rent one for display as at an important dinner, so that the same fruit would grace several tables in the course of its life. So I'm not sure how many of you watch Bridgerton on Netflix, but there was actually a scene at one of the Queen's parties where there was a pyramid of fruit and a pineapple sitting on top. So historically accurate. I thought that was interesting. By the second half of the 18th century, the production of the fruit on British estates had become the subject of great rivalry between wealthy aristocrats. John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, built a hothouse on his estate, surmounted by a huge stone cupola 46 feet tall in the shape of the fruit known as the Dunmore pineapple. So what you see on the screen here is let me see if I can read that. It's actually a painting that was done of the first pineapple being presented to Charles II. That's how important it seemed to be. I thought I had a picture of the Dunmore pineapple. Like I said, so, anyway, it's a building. The top of it exactly looks like a pineapple. Very, very strange. In early settlements, the pineapple was traditionally given as a gift of friendship. And over time, colonial innkeepers added the pineapple to their signs, and bedposts carved with pineapples were a common sight at inns throughout New England. The tradition continues, and to this day, hotels and service industries proudly display and use the pineapple as a symbol of hospitality. So yeah, there's a lot of information you can find out about pineapples as a symbol of hospitality. I found other articles showing that architecture was actually influenced, where you get embellishments that were actually pineapples, carved in stone or wood or what have you. So who knew about pineapples? You can buy them for 99 cents nowadays. Back then it was, I think I read somewhere, it was the price of an ox cart. So greenhouses, the idea of growing plants in a specially controlled environment is at least as old as the ancient Romans. Legend has it that circa 30 AD, Roman royal physicians have warned the ailing Roman emperor Tiberius that he must have a cucumber every day. So the plants were grown under a specially constructed specularium, a house dedicated to growing plants. Constantly maintained fires outside the stone walls to heat the air inside. A translucent roof crafted with thin sheets of mica allows sunlight indoors, and the greenhouse was born. I also read about a part of an article where, even older than this, they used to dig deep pits in the ground and fill it with manure and other things that would decompose, and the heat of decomposition would actually be sufficient to grow some of these exotic plants. But I don't know if I want a manure pit growing my plants. In the 16th century, plant explorers were returning to Europe with exotic species from tropics, and the Italians built the first modern greenhouses called Giardini I'm not Italian, so Giardini Botanici, or botanical gardens to support them. The practice of greenhouse construction spread to Holland and then England, and these early greenhouses were cumbersome, required much work, both to close at night and to prepare for winter weather. Originally expensive status symbols of the wealthy, greenhouses began to be associated with universities as the study of botany grew throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Referred to as conservatories in England, or orangeries and pineries in France, because they allowed orange and pineapple trees to be grown, greenhouses continued to increase in size and complexity. At Versailles, they used 492-foot orangery built between 1684 and 1686 was designed to contain 1,000 orange trees and other subtropical fruits grown in large crates, where they were moved indoors over the winter. It was heated by coal furnaces, but the heating system was so inefficient that some plants froze and others baked, and most were quickly covered in soot, and many would be half dead by spring. Of course, orangeries don't quite fit our modern image of the greenhouse, as they have a solid roof and walls. Only the large doors through which the plants were brought indoors in the fall and out again in the spring were glazed. The orangery of Versailles wasn't actually developed with much thought about letting the sun in. In the Victorian age, greenhouses became more common when high taxes on glass were repealed and window glass became more affordable. Among the grandest greenhouses of the era was the Royal Botanical Gardens of Kew in England, constructed by Queen Victoria. And that's what you see here is the Palm House, which had gotten damaged in the war, fell in disrepair, but it was actually brought back to life. It looks like a beautiful structure. Never been to England, so I couldn't speak. So the first known greenhouses in America were built by Andrew Faneuil, a well-to-do Bostonian, in 1737. George Washington erected a greenhouse at his home in Mount Vernon in which to grow pineapples. By 1825, American greenhouses became more common and might have been heated by a furnace or simply south-facing windows. Today, the largest greenhouse in America is Eurofresh Farms, located in Wilcox, Arizona. It covers more than 318 acres and produces hydroponically grown tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers. Now, I did read that George Washington had the first greenhouse in America, but I found other information that disputed them. So it would have been cute to say Washington was first, but not quite first. Okay, so here's some of the trouble we get. Sugarcane, native to Southeast Asia, first made its way to the New World with Christopher Columbus during his voyage to the Dominican Republic, where it grew well in a tropical environment. So in this case, he took it to the Dominican Republic as opposed to finding it there. Noting sugarcane's potential as income for the new settlements in the Americas, Europeans were already hooked on sugar coming from eastern colonies. I'll skip that part. It wasn't long, however, before the early settlers realized they were lacking sufficient manpower to plant, harvest, and process the backbreaking crop. The first slave ships arrived in 1505 and continued unabated for more than 300 years. Most came from Western Africa, where Portuguese colonies had already established trading outposts for ivory, pepper, and other goods. To most of the European merchants, the people they put on cargo ships across the Atlantic, a horrendous voyage known as the Middle Passage, were merely an extension of the trading system already in place. Sugar slavery was the key component in what historians call the trade triangle, a network whereby slaves were sent to work on New World plantations. The product of the labor was sent to European capital to be sold, and other goods were brought to Africa to purchase more slaves, and then so on and so on. By the middle of the 19th century, more than 10 million Africans had been forcibly removed to the New World and distributed among the sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. During those 3 centuries, sugar was by far the most important of the overseas commodities that accounted for 1/3 of Europe's entire economy as technologies got more efficient and diversified, adding molasses and rum to the plantation byproducts. Sugar barons from St. Kitts to Jamaica became enormously wealthy. The importance of those sugar-rich colonies, especially those belonging to Britain and France, had enormous consequences to the map of the Americas during the 1700s. Britain lost its 13 American colonies to independence in part because its military was busy protecting its sugar islands, many historians have argued. As opposed to slaves working plantations in the U.S. South, Africans on Caribbean sugar plantations outnumbered the European owners by a wide margin. The British planters lived in constant fear of revolt and demanded soldiers for protection. Several decisive battles of the Revolutionary War would have turned out differently had Britain thrown its full might behind the war, experts believe. Sizable garrisons were also stationed in the West Indies to guard the few sugar holdings Britain had left at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. In carving up the Americas after the fighting stopped, King George III had decided to cede a few of his Caribbean sugar islands to France in order to secure a chunk of North America. So interesting about the Revolutionary War, that they might have won had it not been for sugar in the Caribbean. All right. Let's see. What time is it? We got time, I guess. What time do you all want to stop? I can't hear you, Gail.
How much time do you need, Tom?
Well, I'm on page 13 out of 37. I can skip. I've got a whole thing on cotton here. That's really about our West, and then the other things like hemp and medicines and biofuels. It might be interesting. They're a little different than normal. So,
Tom, we usually have about an hour presentation. It sounds like you've probably got 2 hours there.
Yeah.
You commented about maybe it's 2 presentations. Why don't you pick? I would suggest pick and choose and at least give us an hour of advanced training, and then maybe at another time give us something else. Up to you. I'll let Nick can.
Yeah, I've got 2.5 pages on cotton, so we can just highlight it here on the screen. Basically, I can go off the screen.
Okay. Nick, what do you think about an hour? Right? We planned 2 hours total for the meeting.
That's right. We can go a little longer, but at least get an hour for the continuing ed. And Tom, if you find a good stopping spot, then we can continue another time with the rest of it. I mean, it's fascinating so far right now.
Yeah, some of these topics could be a short topic on their own. Expand it a little bit further. So I'm just going to highlight the cotton part. I think a lot of us know about cotton and slaves down in the South. The big thing about cotton is it used to be, locally produced in the little villages and things, and they would pick cotton and they would weave their cloth and things like that. They say it goes back to, the oldest cloth ever found was really in Peru in 6000 BC. So it's been around for a while. And it was common in the Middle Ages as well. And that knowledge from basically the, what do they call it? I can't think of it. It's basically the Middle East, but it got moved. I mean, the cotton manufacturing was introduced to Europe when the Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily, and that was around the 12th century. And then when Sicily was conquered by the Normans, it went to the rest of the Europe. So a lot of these marauding bands of people are moving technology around, technology as it was back then. And Christopher Columbus, of course, found the natives wearing cotton as well, and that lended also to his belief that he was in India, because India was a producer of cotton at the time. The cotton's rise to global importance came about as a result of cultural transformation of Europe and Britain's trading empire. Britain fell in love with cotton fabrics, and they were importing 250,000 pieces a year by the East India Company. And by the 18th century, people started cleaning themselves up and wearing nicer clothes and cleaner clothes, so the cotton was even in more demand. But British cotton products were successful in European markets and accounted for 40.5% of exports by 1786. And their success was also due to the fact that they traded with their own colonies. And of course, many of them had the British mindset of fashion, or whatever you want to call it. But the Anglo-French warfare in the early 1790s restricted access to the continent of Europe, caused the United States to become an important and temporarily the largest consumer of British cotton goods. In 1791, U.S. cotton production was small at only around 2,000 pounds a year. But with demand and innovation, by 1801, it was up to 48 million pounds. Unfortunately, that led to something that was called Alabama fever. So cotton is very tough on the soil, and land fertility declines rapidly. Most of the cotton was grown in the coastal South, the Carolinas, eastern Georgia. So they needed more land. Settlers and speculators established land claims moving west. But of course, it was Andrew Jackson. They passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and they authorized the president to move out the Indians. So most of you may know about the Cherokees being forced out and marched westward in the Trail of Tears. That was all so that the rich land barons and cotton producers could get better land to grow cotton, which, unfortunately, it's really a shame. But again, plants impacting human, and it's not the plant's fault. It's all due to human greed and desire. So, yeah, and then of course, cultivation of cotton using black slaves brought huge profits to the owners of large plantations, making them some of the wealthiest men in the U.S. prior to the Civil War. In the non-slave owning states, farms rarely grew larger than they could be cultivated by one family due to scarcity of farm workers. In the slave states, owners of farms could buy many slaves and thus cultivate large areas of land. By the 1850s, slaves made up 50% of the population of the main cotton states, which were Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Slaves were the most important asset in cotton cultivation, and their sale brought profits to slave owners outside of cotton cultivating areas. Thus, the cotton industry contributed significantly to the Southern upper class's support of slavery. So human suffering in the name of cotton and greed. It's just, one of the things we had to live with in our history. Good old hemp. All right, so this is some of the newer stuff. So how come we're not using hemp, right? Hemp is thought to be the first domestically cultivated plant with evidence of hemp fabric dating 8,000 years ago, found in Turkey, former day of Mesopotamia. Other evidence suggests cultivation further back by 2 or more thousand years. It grows naturally, fast, without fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. In warm climates, it can grow to full height in 3 months and produce fibers 4 times as strong as cotton. It likely originated in southeast Russia, who controlled the bulk of hemp production used in shipping for ropes. As an example, the USS Constitution, that famous ship, required 60 tons of hemp during the War of 1812. So it was a very important crowd. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson both had their own hemp plantations. Benjamin Franklin used hemp paper in his printing business, and it is thought that at least the first draft of the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper from Franklin's mill. In reality, the first signed version of the document was written on parchment and is currently in the National Archives. Well, in 1853, a businessman, you may have heard of this guy, Levi Strauss, switched from making hemp cloth for covered wagons and tents and turned them into pants for California gold miners. He later did switch to a different imported cloth due to complaints of chafing. So I guess the stronger fiber over cotton had its downsides too. There was once a time in American history when farmers could actually be fined or jailed for not growing hemp. Because it was such a valuable crop in Virginia, the Assembly of Jamestown Colony passed legislation in 1619, making it mandatory for every farmer to grow Indian hemp seed. The U.S. Army and the Department of Agriculture jointly produced a 1942 film called Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow hemp for the country's effort in World War II, particularly for textiles and rope, imports of which had been cut off by war. Over 100,000 acres of hemp was growing in the U.S., but all related permits were canceled when World War II ended. In the West, meaning the Western Hemisphere, hemp remained in people's minds equated with a dangerous drug. All right, so why hemp? It's highly renewable. One big reason to switch to hemp for paper is that it's a highly renewable resource. While trees are renewable, it takes 20 to 80 years to replace a tree that has been cut down. Hemp crops, on the other hand, can be replenished and harvested in only 4 months. This means producing more paper for the amount of land being used and saving more of our precious forests. Another big difference with hemp paper as opposed to regular paper sourced from trees is the way hemp is processed. Wood paper requires toxic bleaching chemicals such as chlorine or dioxins to whiten the paper. These chemicals from paper mills can actually poison the waterways. Hemp, on the other hand, can be whitened with hydrogen peroxide, which doesn't pose the same environmental risks. And hemp can also improve the soil in which it's grown. One way it does this is through, phytoremediation, which is when the plant pulls toxic substances out of the soil through its roots. In fact, hemp is so well suited for this that it has been used near Chernobyl to clean up radioactive contaminants from the famous nuclear explosion. In Italy, hemp has been used to clean up dioxins in the soil. Ironically, the same toxic chemical is used for bleaching wood for paper. So if you buy any rope from Chernobyl, just watch out. Hemp is stronger and lasts longer. It creates much stronger, more durable paper than typical paper. Paper from wood quickly decomposes and yellows. On the other hand, hemp is one of the strongest natural fibers in the world. It doesn't yellow, resists decomposition with age, and for longer use paper like books and artwork, hemp can't be beat. It can also be recycled more times, from up to 7 or 8 times. It can be recycled. So, yeah, very interesting about hemp. And I know they recently allowed farmers to start growing hemp in many states. I don't know if it's the federal government or state government. I think it's federal, but yeah. So they're really recognizing its value as, I guess, the fibers primarily. Biofuels. This is interesting. I think a lot of people know about biofuels to some extent, but new plants developed in warm, humid climate, swampy conditions of the Carboniferous period.
Hey, Tom,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, and I don't know if you want questions along the way.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'm just curious, a lot of what you were just describing about hemp, people are not using bamboo for. And I'm just wondering if what your thought is about bamboo.
That I did not research, the bamboo.
No worries.
Yeah. Yeah, I looked at bamboo early on, and a lot of the articles were talking, I mean, some of the ones I saw, and I've seen this myself, they use bamboo for constructing buildings as scaffolding. And also, they've also used bamboo as if, like to strengthen, like rebar almost. But no, I didn't really research the bamboo. I could make a note of that. I could, if this ever becomes useful and want to expand it, I can throw in bamboo too.
Hey, Tom, I have a question about right at the beginning. Did spices become popular because of their food preservation quality, or because it was taste? Because
yeah, I think they had a taste for it. I think that's, yeah. I mean, these are aristocrats that could afford the spices, and I don't think they were so much worried about preserving their food as.
But it makes me wonder why British food isn't better then. No offense to anybody who's, primarily.
Yeah, that I can't say. I'll have to research that one. Why isn't British food better?
Right, if they had all these spices and all these wealthy British people, owned all these colonies, why the heck didn't they get some recipes in the process?
Well, isn't that why Mexican food and Latin food is spicy, because they believe it kills bacteria and stuff, the hot and spicy stuff?
Yeah, that was really my question then.
Yeah. Well, maybe because they're eating it, it's cold. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
Good point, though. Anyway, in the Carboniferous period, all these trees eventually died. Plants put off so much oxygen that the air had more oxygen in it, and the carbon dioxide levels decreased. So no one really knows what happened, but during that period, there was a large die-off of huge trees and ferns, and they fell into the water and didn't have any bacteria to have them decompose, got covered up by more stuff, and these peat beds turned into coal. So that's where a lot of the coal came from. That period where the gymnosperms were growing wildly and were the big plant on Earth. But it was actually the reverse. It wasn't global warming; it was global cooling. Some articles say there was they call it the snowball. The Earth was a snowball at one point. So, but I found conflicting evidence of what that period was like. But anyway, moving away from coal, and the other differences too is like coal, oil comes. Let me see. I didn't write it down, but I believe it was oil comes more from the water-based plant life, as opposed to the swampy ones of the carnivorous. And I don't know if anyone ever follows oil production. Some of the terms you hear sometimes on TV about the Permian Basin. Well, the Permian is a period in the history of the Earth. So it was during that period when the die-off happened and oil was produced in certain areas. So, yeah, that's where that came, the Permian Basins. There's more than one. It's not just Texas. All right. So that's coal, but biofuels are a whole different thing. Plants capture carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and store it in various compounds, such as carbohydrates and oils. These are to be used by the plant, but can also be extracted and processed to provide energy for human use. These are called biofuels, or agrofuel. There's also two terms. Some biofuels can be produced from waste plant material, while others can be produced from plants specifically grown for the purpose. Both liquid and gaseous forms of biofuels can be produced from crops that either have a high sugar content, such as sugarcane or sugar beet, or contain starch that can be converted into sugars, such as corn. These sources of biofuels are considered the first generation. Each source has its advantages and disadvantages. For example, corn has a relatively high requirement for pesticide and fertilizer, and the production rate is low, at an average of just 350 gallons of fuel per acre. Excuse me. Sugarcane is better, yielding 650 gallons of fuel per acre. But there are questions whether you put in more energy. The questions are whether there's more energy is derived from these biofuels than it takes to produce. Wheat, sugar beets, rapeseed, peanuts, and a number of other food crops have all, at one point or another, served as feedstock for biofuel. For the foreseeable future, their importance is waning, and new, better alternatives are being developed. Oops. Second generation biofuels, also known as advanced biofuels, what separates them from first generation is the fact that the source used in producing these biofuels are generally not food crops. The only time the food crops can act as a second generation biofuel is if they have already fulfilled their food purpose. For instance, waste vegetable oil is a second generation biofuel because it has already been used and is no longer fit for human consumption. Because second generation biofuels are derived from different sources, different technology is often used to extract energy from them. This is particularly true of lignocellulose, which tends to require several processing steps prior to being fermented into ethanol. This does not mean that second generation biofuels cannot be burned directly as a biomass. In fact, several second generation fuels like switchgrass are cultivated specifically to act as direct biomass. In other words, burning the plants directly rather than processing. A number of grasses like switchgrass, miscanthus, Indian grass, and others have alternatively been tried. The particular grass chosen generally depends on the location, as some are more suitable to certain climates. In the U.S., switchgrass is favored. Miscanthus is the choice in UK, Europe, and Southeast Asia. So the advantage of grasses as a biofuel are they're perennial, and so energy for planting need only be invested once. They are fast growing and can usually be harvested a few times per year. They have relatively low fertilizer needs. They grow on marginal land. They work well as direct biomass and have a high net energy yield of about 540%. But the disadvantages are not suitable for producing biodiesel. They require extensive processing to make it into ethanol. It may take several years for switchgrass to reach harvest density. And the seeds are weak competitors with weeds. So even though they grow on marginal land, the early investment in culture is substantial. And they require moist soil and so do not do well in arid climates. So biofuel derived from algae is sometimes referred to by the term third generation biofuel. Previously, algae was lumped in with second generation biofuels. However, when it became apparent that algae was capable of much higher yields with lower resource inputs, other than feedstock, many suggested that they be moved to their own category. Algae provide a number of advantages, but at least one major shortcoming that has prevented them from becoming a runaway success. As the potential to produce fuel, no other source can match algae in terms of quantity or diversity. The diversity of fuel that algae can produce results from two characteristics of the microorganism. First, algae produce an oil that can easily be refined into diesel or even certain components of gasoline. More importantly, it can be genetically manipulated, produce everything from ethanol, butanol, to even gasoline and diesel fuel directly. So it sounds like we got the answer, right? Perfect. Butanol is of the great interest because the alcohol is exceptionally similar to gasoline. In fact, it has a nearly identical energy density to gasoline and an improved emissions profile. Until the advent of genetically modified algae, scientists had a great deal of difficulty producing butanol. Now, several commercial scale facilities have been developed and are on the brink of making butanol a more popular biofuel than ethanol, because it's not only similar in many ways to gasoline, but also does not cause engine damage or even require engine modification the way ethanol does. People who work closely with algae have suggested the yields as high as 20,000 gallons per acre are attainable. And according to the U.S. Department of Energy, yields that are 10 times higher than second generation biofuels mean that only 0.42% of the U.S. land would be needed to generate enough biofuel to meet all of U.S. needs. As with everything, algae has its downside, which could be a deal breaker. Algae, even when grown in wastewater, require large amounts of water, nitrogen, and phosphorus to grow. So much, in fact, that the production of fertilizer to meet the needs of algae used to produce biofuel would produce more greenhouse gas emissions than are saved by using algae-based biofuel to begin with. It also means the cost of algae-based biofuel is much higher than fuel from other sources. The single disadvantage means that the large-scale implementation of algae to produce biofuel will not occur for a long time, if at all. In fact, after investing more than $600 million into research and development of algae, ExxonMobil came to the conclusion in 2013 that algae-based biofuels will not be viable for at least 25 years. What is more, that calculation is strictly economical and does not consider the environmental impacts that have yet to be solved. Go electric, right? All right, so got medicine. I hear so a lot of people know medicine comes from plants. Morphine, quinine, aspirin, toxol, foxglove. So the thing that interested me was who was the first person that chewed on bark to solve their problems. But really what happened was with the herbal medicine and, Indians and I guess a lot of cultures around the world, they observed animals self-medicating themselves, self-medicating. So they figured if it's good enough for the apes, then let me give it a try. So that's really how it came to be. And I guess, some people probably died from picking the wrong plant. But yeah, so that's really how it all started, just watching animals self-medicate. That was interesting. And of course, a lot of illegal drugs get derived from plants as well. I haven't got into that at all. So here's an interesting story. Maybe let me just do this one part here, and maybe that'll be enough. I don't know. Probably. All right. So I call it the birth of clinical trials. This is very fascinating. So prior to the enlightenment of modern science, little was known about nutrients contained in foods such as vitamins, minerals, and protein. The causes of illness were not well understood. Common ailments, complaints, and diseases were a mystery to physicians who believed in the long-standing central principle of Western medicine known as humoral theory, which believed that in balancing the four humors, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, could solve all your illnesses. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many sailors who were at sea for prolonged periods of time suffered from scurvy, now known to be caused by a lack of vitamin C. In 1740, the catastrophic result of George Anson's voyage around the world attracted much attention in Europe. Out of 1,900 men, 1,400 men died, most of them allegedly from having contracted scurvy or starvation. So along comes James Lind, who's a Scottish doctor. In 1739, he entered the Navy as a surgeon's mate, served in the Mediterranean off the coast of West Africa, and by 1747 had become the surgeon of the HMS Salisbury in the Channel Fleet. He was a pioneer in naval hygiene in the Royal Navy. Lind argued for health benefits of better ventilation aboard naval ships, improved cleanliness of sailors' bodies, clothing, and bedding, and below-deck fumigation with sulfur and arsenic. He also proposed that fresh water could be obtained by distilling seawater. Although Lind was not the first to suggest citrus fruit as a cure for scurvy, he was the first to study their effect by a systematic experiment in 1747. It ranks as one of the first reported controlled clinical experiments in the history of medicine, particularly for its use of controlled groups. Lind thought that scurvy was due to putrefaction of the body, which could be helped by acids, and thus included a dietary supplement of an acidic quality in the experiment. This began after 2 months at sea when the ship was afflicted with scurvy. He divided 12 scorbutic, I don't know what that means, sailors into 6 groups of 2. They all received the same diet, but in addition, group 1 was given a quart of cider daily. Group 2, 25 drops of elixir of vitriol, which was sulfuric acid. Group 3, 6 spoonfuls of vinegar. Group 4, half a pint of seawater. Group 5 received 2 oranges and 1 lemon, and the last group, a spicy paste plus a drink of barley water. The treatment of Group 5 stopped after 6 days when they ran out of fruit, but by that time, one sailor was fit for duty, while the other was almost recovered. The medical establishment ashore continued to be wedded to the idea that scurvy was the disease of putrefaction, curable by the administration of elixir of vitriol, infusions of wort, and other remedies designed to ginger up the system. In the Navy, however, experience had convinced many officers and surgeons that citrus juices provided the answer to scurvy, even if the reason was unknown. The subsequent Royal Navy of giving citrus fruit, including limes, to sailors resulted in British sailors being given the nickname limeys. Now, they could have been given the nickname of, I guess, oranges, or lemons, but apparently limes last longer on board the ships than those other citrus fruits do. But due to the exemplary investigation, you can look this up, James Lind is often considered the father of naval medicine. To celebrate the day that James Lind started his famous trial to find an effective treatment for scurvy, International Clinical Trials Day is celebrated around the world on or near May 20th each year. So he became famous, didn't even know. But his methodologies for determining, how to cure scurvy really set the standard, more or less, for clinical trials. All right, let me breeze through this. We use beverages all the time. Funny story about coffee. Let me see if I can get down to that. The first person to ever recorded discover coffee was a man named Chaldi in Ethiopia. He was a goat herder, and he saw his goats getting all crazy, eating these little red cherry-like fruit from a certain plant. He tried it himself, and he stayed up all night. So he gave it to his local monk, who said, "Hey, man, we can stay up all night with these long prayer sessions. So the whole monastery started drinking coffee, and from there, coffee spread. And well, I have no reason to believe it's not true, but that's the story. The Arabians realized how important it could be, and the first recorded coffee trees were cultivated in the Arabian Peninsula in 1100. So coffee is fairly new compared to tea. But I added this: unlike tea, the only wars fought over coffee were those between competing chains over market share. So I couldn't find any wars that were started because people wanted to steal their coffee plants or trees. Tea, on the other hand, big deal. So we know about the Boston Tea Party. Obviously, they didn't fight a revolution over tea itself, but it was the taxation and all the things that came after that. So you may wonder why this country is not big tea drinkers. Well, after the Revolutionary War, or maybe even during it, I guess, it was deemed to be unpatriotic to drink tea instead of coffee. So that's why I guess we're all a bunch of coffee drinkers in the U.S. So tea, you know, didn't cause the war, but it was certainly a part of the American Revolution. The real problem, which I found very disturbing, which maybe I'm just not a student of history, that you know, China grew all the tea. Britain wanted to trade for tea. China says, I don't think so. I've seen what happens when you trade with these other countries, and we don't want any part of you. But they eventually had some limited trade. They would trade silver for tea. But then the Chinese would turn around and trade the silver to India to get opium. And round and round and round like that. And China basically says, how much silver do we really need? And so China, one of the emperors decided that they seized one of the British ships, which had enormous quantity of opium on it. I guess I didn't finish that statement there. So what happened was Britain started sending warships along with their trading ships, and war broke out. Lasted 3 years. And the Chinese, in the Treaty of Nanking, I guess, in 1842, decided they agreed to open up 5 ports to British trade, and that's when Hong Kong became British. It was basically over the Opium Wars. There was a second Opium War when the French said, "Hey, I'll work with you. We'll show China something," and gave them more concessions. I don't think there's any more land transferred, but yeah, to me, it's just, again, human tragedy because of desire for profits. So the worst part about this, I'll grab it here. The worst thing, I didn't say worst thing, but during this whole kerfuffle with China, they started growing tea in India. They went and had some people go in and steal some of the plants from China, espionage work, and took it to India and grew tea in India. So by, we have here, I think I wrote down this particular amount. Oh yeah, during all this, the East Indian Company had been working on an alternate plan to source tea from somewhere other than China. So Brave Britain sent industrial espionage agents to China to steal tea plants and see if they could be grown in the new colony of India, another land they conquered. After much trial and error, by the end of the 19th century, they had established immense plantations in India and eventually derived more efficient mechanical ways to make teas that revolutionized the tea industry. These new Indian plantations proved such a success that by 1906, the British were buying from China only 5% of the tea they had bought just 30 years before. I do have one funny story about tea. Let me find it. Cracked up my son pretty good. Just bear with me. Oh, yeah, here we go. All right, so this is what I have. The Chinese have consumed tea for thousands of years. Tea production in China historically was a laborious process conducted in distant and often poorly accessible regions. This led to the rise of many stories and legends surrounding the harvesting process. For example, one story that has been told for many years that a village where monkeys pick tea. According to this legend, the villagers stand below the monkeys and taunt them. The monkeys, in turn, become angry and grab handfuls of tea leaves and throw them at the villagers. There are products sold today that claim to be harvested in this manner, but no reliable commentators have observed this firsthand, and most doubt that it happened at all. So we got goats eating coffee beans and monkeys throwing tea leaves. So I thought that was kind of crazy. All right, let me breeze through the rest of these. Unintended consequences. I think most people know about kudzu, the vine that ate the South. Actually introduced in the U.S. from Japan purposely. Marketed as an ornamental plant and a solution to erosion during the Dust Bowl. Let's see. Yeah. It was cultivated by the Civilian Conservation Corps as a solution for the erosion in the Dust Bowl. The Soil Erosion Service recommended the use of kudzu to help control erosion on slopes, which led to the government-aided distribution of 85 million seedlings and government-funded plantings of kudzu on over 1 million acres. Not surprisingly, kudzu was established throughout the Southeast and is moving into Midwest and Northeast. Kudzu spreads primarily by runners that root at the nodes and are rarely spread by seed. It grows over anything in its path, commonly covers entire mature trees in a blanket of vines, and suppresses native plant growth and prevents other plants from growing across large areas where it's established. So I think we've talked about that in our sessions previously. Japanese knotwood, also called Japanese bamboo, is a member of the buckwheat family. Initially introduced as an ornamental plant from Eastern Asia in the late 1800s, it was also briefly used for erosion control due to its extensive underground root structure. Once sold through seed and plant catalogs, it was soon recognized as a problem during the 1930s when it started appearing where it was not planted. The invasive plant can grow up to 15 feet tall, has hollow stems similar to bamboo. And as with most invasive plants, knotweed thrives in disturbed areas and once established, spreads rapidly. Knotweed will grow in deep shade, threatening the forest understory. It also withstands high temperatures, soil with high salt content, and even drought. This allows it to thrive along roadsides and in right-of-ways. Knotweed is also found along stream banks and wet areas that have been disturbed. I think I have some of that in my yard. So, yeah, good intentions, unintended consequences. All right, let me read through this. So this is, I thought this was interesting. So, you know, garden, obviously, most of us are gardeners, or we're master gardeners. I suppose it doesn't necessarily mean we have a garden, but anyway. It could be ornamental or for food. Hobby is good for stress management. And a 2018 survey found that gardeners spent an average, had spent that year 47 point, hold on, I can't see it on the screen, but 47 point something $million on lawn and garden stuff. And the record household spend of $503 per year. That, you know, for me, that seems a little low. I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but a bag of fertilizer alone will cost you a lot. And a lot of people are buying raised beds nowadays. All right, I'm gonna see if I can squeeze in one more here. This is fascinating. story here. What price beauty? Tulip mania. It's a period during the Dutch Golden Age when contract prices for some bulbs of the recently introduced fashionable tulip reached extraordinary high levels, but collapsed in February of 1637. In general, it's considered to have been the first recorded speculative bubble or asset bubble. So think GameStop stock or anything else like that, where the price goes way higher than it should and then falls drastically. Formal markets appeared in the Dutch Republic during the 17th century, and most notably, they were centered on tulips. At the peak of tulip mania, some single tulip bulbs sold for more than 10 times the annual income of a skilled artisan. As flowers grew in popularity, professional growers paid higher and higher prices for bulbs with the mosaic virus. I thought that was very interesting, which created the multicolored tulips. I didn't put a lot of information, how long it takes to grow. If you grow from seed, it takes years. If you have the little, what do you call them? The little, the bulb will grow little extra bulbs, during its life. They take a couple of years, but it's the secondary bulb that grows, what they call it, that the tulip-specific mosaic virus attacks, and it causes what you see on the right is that kind of plant with the streaks through it. Those are the ones that became the most prized, and they call it tulip mania. That's now associated with any large economic bubble where asset prices deviate from their intrinsic value. So I thought that was fascinating. All right. One of the reasons that the tulip market collapsed, I guess it was a huge market in Harlem, 2 A's, Harlem. Buyers apparently did not show up for the routine bulb auction. So because they didn't show up, they didn't sell, and that started the whole snowball effect. But the reason they didn't show up is an outbreak of bubonic plague. So the bubonic plague may have ended the big giant tulip market. I thought that was fascinating. All right, plant forensics. Let me go through this quickly. You've all seen CSI and those kinds of things. So plant forensics or forensic botany is studying plants for criminal investigations, leaves, flowers, pollen, seeds, wood, fruit, spores, microbiology. To identify these little tiny things stick to a person's clothing, identify where it comes from. You always find out, I found some pollen on the man's sleeve, and that plant only grows over here, and that's where we found the body, kind of thing. So yeah, so that's becoming actually a real job, plant forensics. So I thought that was an interesting thing for anyone interested in biology. All right, so GMOs, I think most of us know about GMOs, but I was trying to find articles. It's hard when you look at articles on GMOs, because usually they're slanted to either I hate GMOs or GMOs are fine. So trying to find the middle ground of what's true is difficult. But the idea is they take something and inject genes that have nothing to do with the original crop. So the most famous one, most common one is corn that actually produces the insecticide BT. I forget what that stands for. But it resists pests. It reduces the need for pesticides by 37%. It obviously increases the crop yields by 22%. So, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing. But there's concerns over health and environment, allergies, cancer-causing agents. When you modify DNA, people think, well, that's what cancer is, isn't it? And the DNA gets screwed up. But they did extensive studies. One was over multiple year animals getting GMO feed. And let me see how many, it was like 100,000 animals they examined. And none of them could show that there really was a problem with GMO feed, and it's kind of deemed safe. Even the Department of Agriculture. Well, it depends on the age of the article you read. So anyway, it has a potential for really helping around the world. I know rice is a focus of the GMO, where they introduced genes, and I think they produce now rice that has vitamin A in it or something, which helps with some countries that yes, this additional genetic modification can increase nutritional value. Rice high in beta carotene, also called golden rice, was developed to help prevent blindness in regions where local diets are chronically deficient in vitamin A. So I suppose preventing blindness is a good thing as compared to the potential for something being a little off. I don't know. It's a trade-off maybe. Anyway, it's it's been around for I think about 18 years, so it's not new, but it's new applications, I think, where you probably see more and more of that. And I know a lot of packaging now says non-GMO, yada, 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 but it's hard to say. There's also cases where I don't know if I wrote it down, but there's a case where they had I forget what the plant was, but they put the genes in from a walnut, I think it was. Oh, here it is. A study from the mid-1990s found that adding a protein from Brazil nuts to GMO soybeans could trigger an allergic reaction to people sensitive to Brazil nuts. So they quickly abandoned that. But that's the kind of thing that could happen, where you have an allergy to one kind of food and they GMO something else and you have no idea, and suddenly you have issues. All right, so I think this is the last one I want to do. This is actually the last of it. Conservation of plant blindness. I thought this was very interesting, and I just came across this term, plant blindness. So there's a couple different ways to term this out. Wildlife is animals and plants, but I think the World Wildlife something or other only recognizes something only recognizes trees in that category as wildlife. But all plants could be considered wildlife. So plant blindness comprises the inability to appreciate the aesthetic and unique biological features of plants and the misguided ranking of plants as inferior to animals, leading to the erroneous conclusion that they're unworthy for human consideration. So the idea there is people don't think of plants going extinct, they only think of animals going extinct. And there's less research being done, less money being put towards conservation, because it's all about the elephants and the rhinos and things like that. Not to say they aren't worthy, but once they got found that every year more plants go extinct annually than animals, and 6 times more plants are listed as threatened by illegal trade. So it's illegal plant trade is a higher economic value than illegal animal trade, and done, can destroy an entire ecosystem. So this was also interesting. These cycads, I guess that's how you pronounce it. Cycads, actually I read about that during the formation of plants. They're really one of the earliest plants on Earth. And they're very similar to palms, but they're not palms. Their own categories. They're considered high risk for illegal trade now. Are one of the most endangered plant groups on the planet. The problem is there's no special Save the Cycad funds or dedicated groups to working to prevent the extinction of an entire group of plants. Yeah, you can look up cycads. They're very fascinating looking plants. They're very odd looking, but they're fascinating just the same.